The warm sunlight streamed through the kitchen windows as Dr. Elena Washington hummed an old gospel tune, stirring a pot of her famous homemade mac and cheese. The aroma of soul food filled her beautiful two-story home, mixing with the sound of children's laughter floating in from the front yard. This was her favorite time of the week, Sunday family dinner with her beloved grandchildren. She smiled as she peeked through the window, watching her 3 grandkids playing tag around the carefully tended flower beds she planted last spring. The youngest one, just 6 years old, squealed with delight as she ran circles around her older cousins, her bright yellow dress matching the daffodils along the garden path. The older 2, ages 8 and 10, chased after her, their playful shouts echoing through the peaceful suburban street. Dr. Washington had lived in this house for over 30 years, building her life and career while raising her own children here. Now a respected civil rights attorney, she'd earned her reputation through decades of tireless work fighting for justice in courtrooms across the state. But here, in her kitchen on Sunday afternoons, she was simply Grandma, the maker of the best sweet potato pie in town and keeper of family stories that stretched back generations. She wiped her hands on her apron and checked the cornbread in the oven, its golden brown crust nearly ready. Family photos covered her refrigerator, graduations, birthdays, and countless precious moments captured over the years. Among them hung her children's academic achievements and her own law degree, earned while working full-time and raising 3 kids on her own. The kitchen timer chimed just as she heard the kids start up a game of hide-and-seek. Their excitement was contagious, and she found herself grinning as she pulled the perfectly baked cornbread from the oven. The house was filled with the kind of joy that only comes from family being together, sharing stories, and making memories. Dr. Washington set the cornbread on the windowsill to cool, watching as her grandchildren played in the yard of her well-maintained home. The flower beds were bursting with spring colors, and her carefully trimmed lawn was the pride of the neighborhood. She'd worked hard for everything she had, teaching her children and grandchildren the value of education, dignity, and standing up for what's right. As she started setting the table with her grandmother's china, saved for these special Sunday dinners, she thought about how blessed she was. At 65, she had a successful career, a beautiful home, and most importantly, a loving family. Her work as a civil rights attorney had helped countless people over the years, but these peaceful moments with her grandchildren were what she treasured most. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across her polished hardwood floors as she called out to the children to come wash up for dinner. Everything was perfect, the mac and cheese bubbling with just the right amount of crust on top, the cornbread cooling on the windowsill, and the sweet tea chilling in her favorite glass pitcher. It was just another blessed Sunday afternoon in the Washington household. Little did she know that this peaceful scene was about to be shattered by an unexpected knock at her door, and her quiet Sunday afternoon would become a moment that would shake her community to its core. But for now, in this precious moment, there was only the sound of children's laughter, the smell of home cooking, and the warmth of family love filling every corner of her home. The peaceful Sunday afternoon shifted in an instant when 2 police cruisers pulled up to Dr. Washington's home, their tires crunching slowly over the gravel driveway. The officers had received a call from one of the newer residents in the neighborhood, someone who'd moved in just 3 months ago and hadn't bothered to meet any of their neighbors. Through the kitchen window, Dr. Washington noticed the patrol cars and felt her heart skip a beat. Her grandchildren were still playing in the front yard, their laughter now mixing with the sound of car doors slamming. She quickly dried her hands and stepped onto her front porch, maternal instinct kicking in as she called for her grandchildren to come inside. Officers Miller and Stevens approached with an unsettling urgency, their hands hovering near their weapons. The taller officer's face was set in a stern expression as he scanned the well-maintained property as if looking for signs of trouble. His partner kept his hand resting on his belt, eyes darting between Dr. Washington and the children who were now huddled behind their grandmother's skirt. "Ma'am, we've received a report of suspicious activity at this address," Officer Miller announced, his tone clipped and authoritative. He didn't introduce himself or ask for her name, just stood there, feet planted wide, looking at her as if she were an intruder in her own home. Dr. Washington felt a familiar knot in her stomach, one she'd experienced too many times before in her decades of civil rights work. She kept her voice steady and calm, thinking of the frightened children behind her. Officers, I'm Dr. Eleanor Washington. This is my home, and these are my grandchildren. We're simply having our weekly family dinner. The second officer stepped forward, his badge catching the afternoon sun. We'll need to see some identification, he demanded, not acknowledging her explanation. The children clutched tighter to their grandmother's dress, confused and scared by the officer's harsh tone. With deliberate movements, Dr. Washington reached for her purse hanging by the door. Of course, officers. I have my driver's license right here. She could feel her grandchildren trembling behind her, their earlier joy replaced by fear. The youngest one whimpered softly, and Dr. Washington wished she could turn around and comfort them. As she handed over her ID, she noticed more patrol cars pulling up to her house. Her new neighbor, the one who'd moved in down the street, stood watching from their driveway with arms crossed, phone still in hand. Dr. Washington recognized them as the person who'd been giving her suspicious looks ever since they'd moved in. This address doesn't match, Officer Stevens said, even though it clearly did. Dr. Washington had lived there for 3 decades. Her address hadn't changed once. She felt her professional instincts kick in, mentally noting every detail of this interaction, every procedural violation, every assumption being made. Officer, if you'll look again, you'll see that this is indeed my address. I've owned this home for 30 years. I'm a practicing attorney, and I would be happy to show you additional documentation. She kept her voice steady, though inside her heart was racing. Not for herself, she'd faced situations like this before, but for her grandchildren, watching their grandmother being treated like a criminal on her own property. The officers exchanged glances, their posture becoming more aggressive rather than less. When Dr. Washington reached for her phone to call her son, Officer Miller stepped forward threateningly. "Ma'am, keep your hands where we can see them," he barked, causing the children to jump. The youngest grandchild began to cry, and Dr. Washington felt a surge of both protective instinct and controlled anger. She'd spent her career fighting against exactly this kind of prejudice, but experiencing it firsthand, with her grandchildren watching, was something altogether different. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across her front porch as more officers arrived, turning what should have been a peaceful family dinner into a scene of unnecessary tension. The smell of cornbread still wafted through the open door, a cruel reminder of the joy that had filled the house just moments before. As Dr. Washington stood there, maintaining her dignity in the face of unfair treatment, she knew this moment would change everything, not just for her family, but for her community. What these officers didn't realize was that they had just confronted the wrong grandmother on the wrong Sunday afternoon, and their actions would have consequences they never could have anticipated. The situation on Dr. Washington's front porch escalated quickly as the evening shadows grew longer. Despite her calm demeanor and clear explanation, the officers seemed determined to create a problem where none existed. The smell of dinner still wafted through the open door, a painful reminder of how quickly this peaceful Sunday had turned into a nightmare. "I'm reaching for my phone to call my son," Dr. Washington announced clearly, making sure her movements were slow and visible. "He's a state senator, and he should be aware of this situation." But before she could complete the motion, Officer Miller grabbed her arm roughly, twisting it behind her back. The children screamed in terror as they watched their grandmother being manhandled. The oldest tried to step forward, but Dr. Washington's voice rang out clear and steady. "Stay back, sweetheart. Everything will be all right. Go inside and call your uncle." Years of legal experience had taught her to remain composed, even as the cold metal of handcuffs bit into her wrists. "Stop resisting," Officer Stevens shouted, though Dr. Washington hadn't moved a muscle. Her glasses slipped down her nose as they pushed her against the porch railing. The hanging baskets of flowers she'd planted that spring swayed violently from the impact, petals scattering across the wooden boards like confetti. "Officers, I am not resisting," she stated firmly, her voice carrying the weight of decades in courtrooms. "You are making a serious mistake. I am a civil rights attorney, and you have no probable cause for this arrest." The neighbor who had called the police stood watching from across the street, phone still raised, recording the entire incident with an expression that mixed shock with something else, perhaps the first stirrings of regret. Through the commotion, Dr. Washington could hear her grandchildren crying inside the house. The youngest one's sobs cut through her heart like a knife, but she knew she had to stay strong and clear-headed. She'd seen too many situations like this go tragically wrong when emotions took over. The mac and cheese began to burn on the stove, its acrid smell replacing the earlier pleasant aromas. One of the officers radioed for backup, as if the grandmother in her Sunday dress somehow posed a threat that required additional force. Dr. Washington felt the eyes of other neighbors peeking through their curtains, watching as this scene unfolded on their usually quiet street. "My security cameras are recording everything," Dr. Washington informed them calmly as they began to walk her toward the patrol car. "And my home security system has already sent an alert to my family members." She knew the importance of documentation, of evidence, of creating a clear record of every injustice. The officers exchanged uncertain glances at this information, but it was too late for them to back down now. They'd already crossed too many lines, violated too many protocols. As they opened the back door of the patrol car, Dr. Washington held her head high, dignity intact despite the humiliation they were trying to inflict. From the front door, she could hear her oldest grandchild talking on the phone, his young voice shaking but clear as he explained what was happening. Pride mixed with sorrow in her chest, pride that he remembered what to do in an emergency, sorrow that he had to learn this lesson so young, had to see firsthand the reality of the world she'd spent her career fighting to change. The patrol car's door slammed shut, and Dr. Washington sat straight-backed on the hard plastic seat. Through the window, she could see her home, her sanctuary now turned into a scene of chaos. The officers stood on her lawn, conferring in low voices, perhaps beginning to realize they'd just made the biggest mistake of their careers. As they pulled away from the curb, Dr. Washington silently prayed for her grandchildren's peace of mind. She knew they were scared, but she also knew this moment would teach them something valuable about standing up for what's right, about maintaining dignity in the face of injustice, about the ongoing fight for equality that she dedicated her life to pursuing. Little did these officers know, but their actions today would set in motion a chain of events that would shake the entire police department to its core. Dr. Washington might be in handcuffs, but her power, her real power, was just beginning to unfold. As the police car pulled into the station's parking lot, the officers still hadn't realized exactly who they had in their custody. Dr. Washington sat quietly in the back seat, her mind already several steps ahead of them. 40 years of fighting civil rights cases had taught her patience and strategy. The booking officer's eyes widened when he saw her being led into the station. "Is that Dr. Washington?" he whispered to his colleague. The whispers spread quickly through the precinct like wildfire. Several officers suddenly became very interested in their paperwork, avoiding eye contact with the grandmother in handcuffs. "I'd like to make my phone call now," Dr. Washington stated firmly, her voice carrying the same authority it held in countless courtrooms. The booking officer fumbled with his keys, nearly dropping them. He'd seen her in action before, watching from the back of the courtroom as she systematically dismantled poorly constructed arrests and constitutional violations. While Officer Miller filled out his arrest report, his hand shaking slightly, Dr. Washington noticed the framed certificates on the wall, workplace discrimination training certificates that she'd helped develop for the department just last year. Her signature was right there, clear as day, on every single one of them. "Young man," she addressed the booking officer calmly, "I believe you were in my civil rights law seminar last spring at the academy. The one about proper arrest procedures and probable cause." The officer's face paled as recognition dawned. He'd taken 3 pages of notes during that lecture, never imagining he'd see those lessons play out in real time. As word spread through the station, more senior officers began emerging from their offices. The watch commander, who had worked with Dr. Washington on the Civilian Oversight Board, came rushing down the hallway. He'd seen her take down entire departments for less than what had just happened on her front porch. The security cameras in the station recorded everything, just as Dr. Washington knew they would. She'd helped write the policy requiring those cameras after all. Every nervous glance, every whispered conversation, every moment of growing realization was being preserved for the record. Her son, the state senator, would already be on his way with a team of attorneys, her former students and colleagues from decades of legal work. But Dr. Washington knew the real power wasn't in the connections she'd built or the positions she held. It was in the meticulous way she documented every violation of procedure, every ignored protocol, every rush to judgment. The younger officers who'd arrested her still hadn't pieced it all together, but their supervisors were starting to sweat. They remembered the last time a department had underestimated Dr. Washington. That police chief had ended up testifying before a grand jury, and half the command staff had been forced to resign. As she waited, Dr. Washington thought about her grandchildren, knowing they were safe with family now. She thought about how this moment, though painful, would become part of their education about justice and perseverance. They'd seen their grandmother stand tall in the face of discrimination, and soon they would see her transform this injustice into change. The station phones started ringing nonstop. News traveled fast in legal circles, and Dr. Washington's network ran deep. Judges she'd argued before, civil rights organizations she'd helped build, community leaders she'd mentored, all were being notified. The officers who'd arrested her had unknowingly stepped into a hornet's nest of their own making. A young clerk brought her a cup of water, hands trembling slightly. Dr. Washington thanked her kindly, noting how the clerk's badge number matched a case file from her records, a workplace discrimination complaint she'd helped resolve last year. Even here, in what should have been a moment of powerlessness, her influence was evident in every corner of the building. The sound of multiple cars pulling into the parking lot echoed through the station. Heavy doors opened and closed as people rushed in. The night was about to get very interesting for everyone involved, and Dr. Washington allowed herself a small smile. Sometimes, the best lessons about justice came from those who thought they could deny it to others. The police station erupted into controlled chaos as Dr. Washington's son, the state senator, strode through the front doors. Behind him came 3 of the city's top civil rights attorneys, each carrying briefcases filled with precedent cases that Dr. Washington herself had won over the years. The click of their dress shoes against the linoleum floor echoed like a countdown to accountability. Within minutes, the police chief was rushing down from his office, his tie slightly askew. He'd been enjoying a quiet Sunday dinner with his family when the call came in. Now he stood face to face with a nightmare scenario. One of the state's most respected civil rights attorneys had been wrongfully arrested in front of her grandchildren. "Release her immediately," the police chief ordered, his voice carrying across the station. The booking officer couldn't get the handcuffs off Dr. Washington fast enough. As she rubbed her wrists, her son wrapped her in a tight hug, whispering, "Are you okay, Mom?" Even in this moment, she maintained her composure, patting his back reassuringly. The mayor's office was already calling. News vans were pulling up outside the station, their satellite dishes reaching into the darkening sky like metal trees. Someone had leaked the body camera footage to the local news stations, and the videos were downing. The officers' aggressive approach, their dismissal of Dr. Washington's explanation, the unnecessary force, all of it captured in high definition. But the body cameras weren't the only evidence. Dr. Washington's home security system had caught everything from multiple angles. The clear footage showed her well-maintained home, her professional demeanor, her frightened grandchildren, and the officer's complete disregard for proper procedure. The cameras had even captured the neighbor who made the call, their body language revealing their unfounded suspicions. The station's conference room transformed into an impromptu war room. The police chief, sweating through his shirt, sat across from Dr. Washington and her legal team. Her son, the senator, played the security footage on his laptop. With each passing minute, the chief's face grew paler. He'd known Dr. Washington for years. They'd served together on community boards, worked on police reform initiatives. Now he was watching his officers destroy decades of community trust in less than 30 minutes. Outside the conference room, Officers Miller and Stevens sat on a bench, their shoulders slumped. Their commanding officer had already collected their badges and guns. Both officers had exemplary records before this, but their actions today had revealed biases they didn't even know they carried. As they watched more lawyers arrive at the station, the reality of their situation began to sink in. The neighbor who had made the call was brought in for questioning. Under the fluorescent lights of the interview room, their flimsy explanation fell apart. No, they hadn't seen any criminal activity. No, they hadn't tried to speak with Dr. Washington before calling the police. Yes, they had moved into the neighborhood recently. And yes, they had made similar calls about other black residents in their previous neighborhood. Dr. Washington's phone wouldn't stop buzzing with messages of support. Community leaders, former clients, judges, and fellow attorneys, All were rallying behind her. The incident was trending on social media, with hundreds of thousands of people sharing the security camera footage. Each share, each comment, each expression of outrage built momentum for the change that was coming. Local news crews interviewed neighbors who had witnessed the arrest. They spoke about Dr. Washington's kindness, her professional achievements, her dedication to her grandchildren. One elderly neighbor broke down crying as she described watching the children's faces as their grandmother was handcuffed. These testimonies painted a vivid picture of not just an injustice, but a community wounded by witnessing it. As midnight approached, Dr. Washington finally prepared to leave the station. She had given her official statement, reviewed the evidence, and set in motion the wheels of justice. But before she left, she paused to speak with the young officers who had arrested her. Her words weren't angry or vengeful. Instead, she spoke about learning, about growth, about the responsibility each person has to examine their own biases and work to overcome them. The night air was cool as Dr. Washington emerged from the station, surrounded by family and supporters. Television cameras caught her dignified exit, her head held high. In less than 6 hours, she had transformed a moment of personal humiliation into powerful catalyst for change. Tomorrow would bring press conferences, policy meetings, and calls for reform. But tonight, she was heading home to hug her grandchildren and remind them that justice, though sometimes slow, was always worth fighting for. By Monday morning, the video of Dr. Washington's arrest had spread across the country like wildfire. People couldn't believe their eyes. A respected grandmother and civil rights attorney arrested on her own front porch while making Sunday dinner for her grandchildren. The security camera footage played on every major news channel, each replay adding fuel to the growing outrage. The police department held an emergency press conference at 9 a.m. The chief stood at the podium, dark circles under his eyes suggesting a sleepless night, and announced that both officers had been placed on immediate administrative leave. The department's Internal Affairs Division had already launched a full investigation, but the damage to public trust was clear in every reporter's pointed question. Dr. Washington's front yard became an impromptu gathering place for community members, bringing flowers, cards, and home-cooked meals. Her grandchildren watched from the window as people they'd known their whole lives came to show support. The youngest one asked, "Grandma, why are all these people bringing us food?" Dr. Washington hugged her close and explained how communities come together when something wrong needs to be made right. The neighbor who had made the call faced their own consequences. Local news crews discovered their history of making similar unfounded calls in their previous neighborhood. Their employer, a major corporation downtown, released a statement distancing themselves from the incident and announcing mandatory diversity training for all employees. The neighbors' social media posts revealed a pattern of bias that could no longer be ignored or excused. By Tuesday, peaceful protesters filled the streets around City Hall. They carried signs with Dr. Washington's photo and quotes from her decades of civil rights work. Young law students who had studied her cases stood alongside elderly community members who remembered her early days fighting for justice. The crowd's chants echoed off the building's marble walls. No more bias. No more fear. The body camera footage revealed even more troubling details. The officers had muted their microphones several times during the incident, a direct violation of department policy. They had failed to call for a supervisor when Dr. Washington identified herself as an attorney. The footage showed them ignoring her multiple attempts to explain the situation calmly. Each violation added another layer to the case building against the department. Community leaders organized a town hall meeting at the local church. The pews filled with concerned citizens, activists, and police officers who wanted to be part of the solution. Dr. Washington sat in the front row, listening as speaker after speaker shared their own experiences with racial profiling. Her quiet dignity spoke volumes, even as others told their stories of similar injustices. The police department's Civilian Oversight Board, which Dr. Washington had helped establish years ago, called an emergency session. They reviewed not just this incident, but patterns of response to calls about suspicious persons in predominantly white neighborhoods. The data painted a clear picture of systemic bias that could no longer be ignored. Local businesses put up signs supporting Dr. Washington and calling for police reform. The incident had forced many in the community to confront uncomfortable truths about their own biases. Even people who had initially dismissed similar complaints in the past found it impossible to ignore the evidence before their eyes. A grandmother in her Sunday best, making dinner for her grandchildren, treated like a criminal on her own property. The two officers who made the arrest requested a meeting with Dr. Washington through their union representative. They wanted to apologize face to face, to explain their actions, to understand where they had gone wrong. Dr. Washington agreed to meet them, seeing an opportunity for education rather than just punishment. She knew that real change required more than just removing a few officers. It required changing hearts and minds. Social media exploded with support from across the country. #JusticeForWashington trended nationwide. Other grandmothers shared stories of similar experiences. Civil rights organizations used the incident as a teaching moment, creating educational materials about racial profiling and citizens' rights. The conversation grew beyond one incident to address deeper issues of bias and accountability. As the week drew to a close, Dr. Washington sat in her kitchen, once again preparing Sunday dinner. The smell of comfort food filled the air as her grandchildren played nearby, their laughter a bit more subdued but slowly returning. She looked at the flowers covering her dining room table, each bouquet representing a neighbor's love and support. The incident had shaken her community, but it had also awakened something powerful, a renewed commitment to justice and change. 1 month after the incident, Dr. Washington stood at a podium in front of City Hall, surrounded by community leaders and supporters. The lawsuit she filed against the police department had been settled in record time, but she wasn't interested in personal gain. Instead, she had negotiated something far more valuable: real, lasting change in police practices. The settlement money would establish the Community Justice Foundation, a new organization dedicated to preventing racial profiling and promoting police accountability. Dr. Washington insisted that the foundation's board include not just legal experts and community leaders, but also reformed police officers who understood the importance of unlearning biases and building trust. Her grandchildren sat in the front row during the announcement, dressed in their Sunday best. The youngest one beamed with pride as she watched her grandmother speak about turning pain into progress. These children had witnessed both injustice and the power of standing up against it, a lesson more valuable than anything they could learn in school. The new police training program, developed with input from Dr. Washington herself, went far beyond traditional sensitivity training. Officers would spend time in the communities they served, sharing meals with families, attending local events, and learning the stories of the people they were sworn to protect. The program became a model for departments across the country. The neighbor who had made the call that Sunday afternoon became an unexpected ally in the fight for change. After several honest conversations with Dr. Washington, they began speaking at community meetings about their own journey of recognizing and addressing internal biases. Their stories showed others that growth and change were possible when people were willing to confront uncomfortable truths. The two officers who had arrested Dr. Washington went through the new training program first. Their experience became a case study in how quickly assumptions and fear could escalate a peaceful situation into a crisis. They now helped train other officers, sharing their story as a warning about the dangers of unchecked bias and the importance of following proper procedures. In schools across the city, teachers used the incident as a teaching moment. Students discussed civil rights, community responsibility, and the power of standing up for justice. Dr. Washington visited classrooms, sharing her story and encouraging young people to become advocates for change in their own communities. The police department's dispatch system was completely overhauled. New protocols required dispatchers to ask detailed questions about suspicious person calls, helping to identify potential bias before officers were deployed. The number of unnecessary confrontations dropped dramatically within the first 6 months of implementing these changes. Dr. Washington's home became a symbol of resilience and progress. The flower beds where her grandchildren had played that Sunday afternoon now bloomed more beautifully than ever, tended by neighborhood volunteers who stopped by regularly to help with gardening and share stories. The front porch where she had been handcuffed became a place where neighbors gathered to discuss community improvements. Local businesses joined the effort, providing internships and job training for young people interested in law enforcement and community advocacy. The Community Justice Foundation helped coordinate these efforts, building bridges between different parts of the community that had previously remained separate and suspicious of each other. The changes spread beyond the city limits. Other communities reached out to learn from their example. Dr. Washington traveled to speak at conferences and police academies, sharing the lessons learned from that Sunday afternoon. Her grandchildren often accompanied her, witnessing how their grandmother's strength and wisdom were helping to create a better world. 1 year after the incident, the city held a community celebration in the park near Dr. Washington's home. People from all walks of life came together to share food, music, and stories. The police chief and officers mingled with residents, playing games with children and engaging in real conversations. As Dr. Washington watched her grandchildren playing safely under the watchful eyes of the entire community, she knew that sometimes the worst moments could lead to the best changes.